Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. The Brexit campaign has asked the BBC to do one pretty small favour for it in the run-up to the EU referendum, which is to differentiate between Europe and the EU, to encourage its reporters only to say Europe when they're referring to the continent of Europe, and to say the EU when they're referring to the Brussels-run union of 28 member states. And the BBC has refused, or it has at least failed to clarify these two very different terms and when they may be used by its staff. And this means, I think, that the BBC has implicitly given its nod of approval to its reporters to say Europe when they really mean the EU. And some observers think that the Brexit lobby is basically mad for asking for this reporting clarification from the BBC. So a writer for the New Statesman said it showed that some people will find bias in the most innocuous of things. In other words, chill out. It is not a problem that the national broadcaster interchangeably uses the terms Europe and the EU. Stop making a fuss about nothing, you Europhobic idiots. That's the message coming from most of the media and pretty much from the BBC. But I think the BBC's unwillingness to maintain or enforce a distinction between the phrase Europe and the phrase the EU is actually really revealing, really important, and extremely worrying. Because I think it speaks to one of the worst aspects of the debate about the EU at the moment, which is this conflation of the Brussels-based oligarchy called the EU with the continent of Europe. This depiction of the small, unaccountable cliques who peer down at Europe from their air-conditioned towers in Brussels with Europe itself. Think about some of the phrases that could potentially be used by BBC reporters if they use Europe to mean when they mean EU. They could say, for example, that the people of Peterborough, which is one of the most anti-EU parts of Britain, God bless them, they could say that those people are against Europe. They could say that the people of Warrington, which is the 7th most Eurosceptic part of Britain, they could say that those people hate Europe or are voting to get out of Europe. But of course they're doing no such thing. Britain isn't leaving the continent of Europe. That's not possible. That isn't what we're voting on. And these people in Peterborough and Warrington and across Britain might actually love Europe. Many of them probably do. They might holiday in Spain, they might have friends in France, they might love Swedish TV dramas, as everyone does these days. Many, if not most of them, won't be anti-European at all. They're just anti-EU. So the Stay campaign's habit of conflating Europe and the EU, what it really means is that those who are anti-EU can be easily depicted as being anti-Europe, as being xenophobic, as being nationalistic. These people's political outlook, i.e. their dislike of the fact that Brussels can impose its writ on nation states, their political outlook is reduced to a prejudiced outlook, a simple case of being anti-Europe. Their politics is pathologized. It's turned from opposition to a political system into opposition to a whole continent, and more importantly, to its people and its cultures. This is why we so often see the term Europhobic, which is literally my least favorite word in the English language. Because this term explicitly pathologizes people's dislike or opposition to the EU. It treats it almost as a mental illness. A phobia is an irrational fear. The Guardian recently said that ordinary people's Europhobia is being pandered to and fed by Tory leaders. In other words, there is a fearful, irrational mob out there, and the Tories are recklessly stirring us up. This week, a writer for New Europe magazine listed Europhobia alongside xenophobia, nationalism, Islamophobia, and racism as values that are, he says, alien to our post-war European culture. So you can see how casually criticism of the EU, political opposition to the Brussels oligarchy, is reduced to a phobia, an ism, something that goes against the ideals of Europe itself. And I think we really must challenge this really cynical conflation of Europe and the EU. And we must challenge the pathologization of the critics of Brussels as phobic or dumb or racist. Because to my mind, the EU and Europe are not even remotely the same thing. Actually, I'd go further and say that the EU actually grates against everything that is brilliant about Europe. The EU is an ugly, illiberal, undemocratic blot on the wonderful continent of Europe. The EU is a stain on the best, most inspiring values of Europe and of the peoples of Europe. It is the EU that is anti-Europe. I love Europe, but I hate the EU. I consider myself a European. I don't have any special emotional attachment to Great Britain. When I hear other Brexit campaigners saying, oh, Britain is so great, we can do everything on our own, I feel like giving them a slap. I mean, I love London, but I'm kind of Irish, and if I could afford it, I would live in Paris. So for me, this is not about defending some idea of the fantastic nature of Great Britain against Europe. My argument for getting out of the EU is not a little Englander one. It is not because I think Britain is the best country in the continent. I don't think it is. Sorry. It's not because I love the pound and the Queen. I don't love the Queen. I can't wait for her to go, and we can turn Buckingham Palace into a people's museum. I'm against the EU because the EU is detrimental to the whole of Europe, and particularly to two really important values that European peoples have been fighting for tooth and nail for hundreds of years: democracy and liberty. The EU is anti-democratic and illiberal, and that is why we must leave. Supporters of the EU tell us it is this kind of happy-clappy union of European peoples. That's nonsense. It is a union of European elites who want to avoid their peoples. The EU is fundamentally the mechanism through which national governments outsource various powers and decision-making processes to distant, aloof, mostly unaccountable bodies, like the European Commission, like the European Court of Justice, and so on. The real instinct behind the Brussels machine, the whole Brussels oligarchy, is not to bring Europe together. It is to absolve national governments of the pesky burden of having to consult us, the plebs, about important political and social matters, in favour of allowing various experts and cliques in Brussels to discuss and determine those matters on our behalf. The EU's fuel, its real fuel, is not cosmopolitanism, it is the desire to avoid democracy. From the outset, right from the very beginning, the EU has not been the embodiment of the European people's will. It has been a struggle against the European people's will. The 1992 Maastricht Treaty, which brought the EU as we know it into being, was only just approved by France. It was rejected by Denmark. And of course, it was not put to a referendum at all in Britain. British people were co-opted into the EU without our explicit consent. Almost every time they have been asked to give their verdict on the EU, the people of Europe have said, we don't want it. In Ireland in 2001, voters said no to the Nice Treaty. In 2005, the new EU constitution was rejected by voters in France and Holland, by a pretty significant majority of voters. EU bureaucrats then denounced the French and Dutch as ignorant and pissed off. One MEP said it was mad to subject something as important as the EU's constitution to what he called the lottery of public opinion. The European Commission responded to the French and Dutch people's disobedience by renaming the EU constitution the Lisbon Treaty, which the EC Vice President Margot Wallström admitted was essentially the same proposal as the old constitution. The thing that the French and the Dutch people democratically rejected was brought back under a new guise. That is cynical and undemocratic. And this time, the people would not be asked to vote on the refashioned constitution because, in the words of the then French President Nicolas Sarkozy, a referendum now would bring Europe into danger. So democracy is dangerous. Democracy, in their eyes, is a threat to what they perceive to be Europe. The people's will is a danger. It's risky. It creates uncertainty. It's something that runs counter to the EU project. In 2008, the Irish people were permitted to vote on the Lisbon Treaty, and they said no. They were then slammed and defamed by Brussels bureaucrats and forced to vote again a year later, and under the pressure of the EU's economic blackmail, which is the only way it can be described, they said yes the second time round. They gave the right answer. The EU is not an expression of the European people's will at any level. On the contrary, it is constituted in direct opposition to the people's will. The people's will is a danger to this project. And this kind of innate hostility of the EU to national sentiment and to democratically elected governments can also be seen in its constant hectoring and reprimanding of the governments of Eastern Europe. In 2006, the elected Prime Minister of Slovakia was instructed by Brussels to challenge political extremism in his country and to repress certain political ways of thinking or risk being in a violation of EU regulations. In 2006, the Prime Minister of Poland, the elected Prime Minister of Poland, was forced by Brussels to declare that he is not homophobic or anti-Semitic, and that his government would not bring back the death penalty, regardless of whether the people of Poland wanted him to or not. In 2011, the EU pressured the Hungarian government to rethink its new constitution, which it had just written, actually one of the first democratically written constitutions in Hungary's history. In my mind, it wasn't a particularly nice constitution. It was quite illiberal, but it was written by a democratically elected government. In 2000, when the far-right Freedom Party won 27% of votes in Austria, enough to enter into a coalition government, Brussels imposed diplomatic sanctions on Austria. Brussels said there would be no business as usual so long as the Freedom Party remained in government. The Freedom Party that had just been elected by huge numbers of Austrian people. And Brussels' lecturing of Eastern European governments doesn't only expose the anti-democratic instincts of the EU, it also really gives the lie to the idea that the EU has united the nations of Europe. It's done no such thing. Actually, the EU has nurtured new and deep divisions in Europe, primarily between the apparently civilized west of Europe and the allegedly dark, twisted, weird east of Europe, which must be constantly punished and corrected. The Iron Curtain is back, but in a new PC way. And the Brussels oligarchy's view of democracy as, in Sarkozy's word, dangerous, really became most apparent in 2011. In that year, the EU worked to impose technocratic governments in Greece and Italy, and to import a gang of bankers and bureaucrats to Dublin to keep an eye on the Irish government and to make sure that it enforced the right austerity measures. The EU rode roughshod over democracy in 2011 and installed benign tyrannies in at least 3 countries. And Mario Monti, the unelected technocrat who was charged with running Italy on behalf of Brussels, actually boasted about the aloof regime that he was in charge of. He said, "The absence of political personalities removes any ground for disagreement." That really cuts to the heart of what the EU and its lackeys hate most: politics, personality, colour, debate, disagreement, what people want, what people think. They far prefer the rule of experts, the rule of technocrats. And their fanboys in the media agree with them that technocracy is sometimes preferable to democracy. So in 2011, in that terrible year in European history, which I hope future historians at least will look back on with horror, in 2011, The Guardian published an article headlined, "In Defense of Europe's Technocrats." It argued that temporary technocratic rule may well be acceptable, perhaps necessary, at a time of crisis. Here we have an explicit defense of the destruction of democracy, an open, unabashed argument for the rule of the unelected. And it is coming not from the far right or neo-fascists or the various other people who we are constantly told pose a great threat to democracy in Europe, but it's coming rather from The Guardian, from so-called liberals, from the supposed cosmopolitans of the EU project. Some people argue that the EU is our best guard against the kind of tyranny Europe experienced in the 1930s and 40s. And as they say this, exactly as they say this, Brussels installs unelected leaders, blackmails elected leaders, and describes democracy as a danger. Under the cover of keeping at bay the tyrannies of the past, the EU constructs a new kind of tyranny for today. And these vile attacks on the voters of France and Holland and Ireland, this dictating to the elected governments of Eastern Europe, this enforcement of technocratic rule in Greece and Italy, none of this is accidental or merely a response to particularly tense, crisis-ridden moments in Europe in recent years. No, it is in the very nature of the EU to be suspicious of or plain hostile to the views and attitudes and will of the European people. In fact, the EU has shaped itself precisely around European elites' feeling of exhaustion with the democratic process. The EU is the means through which politics can be done in a new, distant, post-democratic way. And to that end, at the very top of Brussels, we have the dreaded, horrendous European Commission, a body that is emblematic of the EU's feeling of agitation with democracy. This is the executive body responsible for proposing EU legislation, and it is, of course, unelected. It has 28 members, one for each member state, who are nominated by the member states. And you have no more power to get rid of this tiny clique of commissioners that makes laws on your behalf than you have of walking on the moon this evening. You have no control, no direct democratic control over these 28 individuals. They are beyond your reach, yet they construct laws that have an impact on your life. That is fundamentally contradictory to the spirit and the letter of democracy. It goes against the fundamental principle of democracy, which is that a people must consent to the institutions that they are ruled by. The EU doesn't only trash democracy in all those various horrific ways, it restricts liberty too. It is profoundly illiberal at heart. This vast oligarchical entity is unsurprisingly hostile to the idea that people should be free to think whatever they want, to say whatever they want, and to live their lives however they want, so long as they don't harm anyone else. It is hostile to that fundamental principle of liberty. The EU does not trust the people of Europe. It continually passes rules or laws that seek to govern your minds and your lives. It has, for example, told all national governments to restrict speech that incites hatred based on race, sex, religion, or nationality, which is an explicit attack on freedom of speech. It has seriously discussed not only outlawing Holocaust denial, which would be illiberal enough, in my view, but also the denial of various other crimes against humanity, which would massively dent academic freedom and the freedom of historical debate. And its illiberalism is often just mad and petty. So it has banned chocolate candy cigarettes on the basis that they appeal to minors and they could be a gateway to real smoking. It has passed regulations designed to protect what it calls vulnerable consumers, i.e. stupid, ordinary people, including by restricting the advertising of formula milk to new mothers, because in the EU's eyes, new mothers should be breastfeeding, and if they aren't, there's something wrong with them. It wants to ban diabetics from driving. It enforces controls on products that use a certain amount of electricity in an attempt to make us uncaring idiots more eco-friendly, whether we want to be or not. The EU thinks our nationally expressed political will is dangerous, and it also thinks it is dangerous to leave us to our own devices, to let us say what we want, think what we want, buy what we want, behave as we want. This is an institution that is explicitly designed to circumscribe your democratic rights and your everyday ability to govern your life. It goes against what it means to be European. For hundreds of years, through democratic upheavals, revolutions, struggles against religion, struggles for enlightenment, the peoples of Europe have, in various different ways, tried to gain greater control over their nation's political affairs and greater control over their own lives. Those have been the two great goals of pretty much every progressive movement in Europe over the past few hundred years. People having greater control over their national affairs and greater control over their everyday life. The EU undermines both of those things, both democracy and individual liberty. It is against Europe. It is against the history of Europe. It is against us. And as someone who considers himself left-wing, I'm really horrified that lefties are often at the forefront of defending this elitist institution. In my mind, it is an historic black mark on the reputation of the left that it has been the chief cheerleader of an institution that undoes so many of the great gains of radicals and progressives of the past. We must leave the EU in order to defend our democratic clout, in order that we can reassert control and restate our consent to the institutions that govern our lives and write our laws. But we must do more than that. I don't think a Brexit is enough. It sounds a bit too selfish for my liking. We must also encourage and offer solidarity to other European peoples who want to leave the EU, of which there are millions and millions. Too much of the current debate is focused around what will happen to Britain if we leave. My concern is what will happen to the other people of Europe who have to stay in this awful institution. We must fight with them, alongside them, to create a new and a real unity across Europe. A union not of elites who distrust the people, but a union of peoples who have had more than they can take of these backward elites. Thank you.
Now we have time for about 30-45 minutes questions, so just start.
Hi, my name is Tim. I'd just like to take you up on three things you said. Firstly, early on in your speech, you said that the European Court was part of this thing. Leaving the EU would have no effect on our status with the European Court, because that is solely under the Council of Europe. So I'm a little confused as to why you bring it up while we're discussing leaving the EU. The second thing I wanted to raise with you is the fact that you make a very solid case for leaving the EU. However, you don't talk about what happens next. You talk about the reasons why, but you don't offer an alternative, which is a feature of many of the cases for now at the moment. And the third and final point that I want to make is that there is some confusion about you said that the European Commission is unelectable. You are right, but it is unelectable in the same way as the cabinet of this country is unelected. We appoint MPs. The party with the max number of MPs forms the cabinet. In the case of the Commission, our governments select commissioners. I just want you to perhaps touch on that a little bit more, on what you see as if we were to stay in, what would you see as a reform that would make it more agreeable?
It's unreformable. There's no reform that can be made to the EU because it's not an accident that it takes this extremely tyrannical approach, for example, to Greece and Italy and Ireland, that it has such contempt for the people of France and Holland, and for the people of Britain, actually. If you read Annie's statement, in Tony Blair, in his last ever interview as Prime Minister, I think it was, said something like, the people of Britain may disagree with the leaders of Britain about the future of Europe, but they're clever enough to know not to do anything about it, something like that. So constant contempt for every single people in Europe. It's not accidental. The EU is shot through with a disdain for democracy because I think it emerged from, I don't think, some of the Brexit camp had too much of a tendency to think that there's this kind of German/French conspiracy to do over good old Britain. Oh, that's it. I don't go along with that Brexit view that there is this kind of, Angela Merkel, Hollande conspiracy to rule Europe at our expense. I think the EU emerges from individual nation states already existing feeling of exhaustion with their peoples and with the idea of democracy, which is something which emerged in the 70s and 80s and then took this kind of institutional form. It's unreformable because it's not designed to be a democratic union. It's designed to be an undemocratic collection of elites, bureaucrats and experts. And the only solution to that is to get rid of them. So it's unreformable. I think in relation to the courts, we would still be beholden to the European Court of Human Rights, but not as much to the European Court of Justice. Now, in my ideal world, we also wouldn't be beholden to the European Court of Human Rights because I'm not in favour of human rights legislation. Because if you read human rights legislation, anyone who reads the breathtakingly turgid European Convention on Human Rights, you realise actually it's not a guarantor of freedom at all, it's a check on freedom. Every single right that it lists, you have the right to freedom of speech, you have the right to private life, you have the right to this, that and the other, comes with so many caveats, you could literally spend all day reading it. You have the freedom of speech, except in a state of national emergency, libel, defamation, public disorder, blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on. And the distinctive thing about human rights legislation as opposed to the American Bill of Rights, where the American Bill of Rights was about telling governments what they mustn't do, you will not pass a law against freedom of speech. You will not curb people's right to own guns. The European Convention on Human Rights is about telling governments what they must do. You must give people freedom of speech, as if we don't already have it. And you must curb it in certain situations. So I'm against human rights. So my ideal world would be out of the Human Rights Court as well, but that is much more complicated. In terms of the Cabinet Commission comparison, I just think it's very, very different. We have a much more direct, interactive relationship with the government that we elect. And that impacts even on who's selected for cabinet. You think if someone gets embroiled in a controversy or becomes unpopular or pisses off enough people, in a blink of an eye they'll be out. There's a relationship between the government that we elect, the cabinet they appoint, and us. It's not ideal. I am not here to defend British democracy. I want the Queen gone. I want the House of Lords gone. I think we should be unicameral. I think we should have annual elections. I'm a leveller from that perspective. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we have a much more interactive relationship with our cabinet than we do with the Commission. And the difference is our government exists in a world in which we can say every 4 years, you're out. The EU oligarchy is vast and confusing, and it's designed to be confusing. Things disappear. Things happen without anyone knowing. Things are changed without anyone knowing. It's this horrible, monarchical, medieval institutions, which is designed to swallow up our rights and to refashion politics and law on our behalf. It's not comparable to the fact that we elect a government that appoints a cabinet. It's a really different situation.
So you mentioned how the culture of the European Commission, the European Union, is to one of contempt for its national peoples. Do you think that sort of culture has pervaded through to David Cameron and his handling of the referendum, in the sense that he's bandying about the fact that, there's no out option, when deliberately not allowing his government to plan for such an option, and the way he's holding the referendum in trying to get it done as quickly as possible on his terms, rather than doing a referendum in the Australian or Swiss style, where it's a much more fair and level playing field?
Yeah, I think it's very fast. I think there's a lot of fear mongering, which I find really objectionable, and there does seem to be this attempt to crush the opposition, not so much crush the opposition, but to stymie the influence of the opposition, or to scare people into giving the right answer. But having said that, the fact is that we have been given the choice, and it's within our power, everyone, literally, not only to vote, but also to go out and influence people and inspire people and talk to people between now and June. Is it June? I've forgotten. Between now and June to change the outcome. So I think, yes, but it is a bit quick and cramped and weird. But if you let that get to you too much, it might kind of stop you from doing what it is your responsibility to do, which is to spend the next few months arguing with people and trying to change their minds and trying to shift the actual outcome. We've been given a really important decision to make, and I will be so gutted if we vote to stay in. So there's a lot of work to be done. You've got to actually work. And everyone keeps saying, Boris is on the this side and someone else Cameron's on that side. But what you have to remember, the great thing about democracy is that they have exactly the same power as you to determine the outcome of this referendum. Exact same power. Of course, they can speak on TV and write articles and all that stuff. But when it comes to it, when you're in the ballot box, they have the exact same power as you. So it's a really good reminder of the wonderfulness of democracy. Boris Johnson has the same power to determine our relationship with the EU as the woman who cleans this building. And so we've got to go out and convince everyone to make the right choice. And I don't think if we lose and people say after the event, it wasn't fair, it was too good, I'll be really angry. So the onus is on changing the result rather than complaining about the structure of it, I think.
Yeah. This is only tangential. First of all, thank you for the speech. You said you didn't think Britain was the greatest country in Europe. What is this?
What is the greatest country? I think France. Or maybe Germany. Look, I love Britain. Really, I do. It might be like the second best country, so I'm not doing it down. But I don't really think of myself as British, if I'm being perfectly honest. I think of myself as, I have a British passport, I have an Irish passport. I think of myself as London Irish. So it's not about being British for me. That's not what it's about. I know that is what it's about for other people. For me, it's about doing something to re-energize the argument for democracy and the argument for freedom, and doing that by arguing against what I and lots of other people consider to be the greatest block to that, which is the EU, Brussels, Strasbourg, all those institutions. So I'm not a British nationalist, and I'm not a Little Englander. And I think the argument I was trying to make is that if you love Europe, you should hate the EU. That's the way I see it. So I would say France.
Feel free to disagree.
Me? Oh, sorry. You've spoken about why the elites would want Europe, the European Union, to be the way the European Union is. Why do you think the foot soldiers and useful idiots and so on in universities and elsewhere so passionately support the EU and all its works? What is the emotional fuel for these people to get out there every third or fourth Saturday to hand out leaflets and argue the case for Europe? What keeps them going?
I think it's a similar drive, which is a instinctive distrust of ordinary people. I think feeling an attachment to the EU has become the acceptable way of expressing your feeling of detachment from the people within your own nation. So you can't go around saying, oh, these stupid fat people who watch football, or these idiotic plebs who wave the St. George's flag, they're so vulgar and disgusting, although some people still do say that. But you can't, it's not, yeah, exactly, but it's not acceptable to say that. So instead you say, oh, I'm really cosmopolitan and post-borders, and I'm so switched on. Like Nick Clegg's always going on about his Spanish wife and his Spanish children and his French friends and all that stuff, which gets annoying after a while, because what they're doing is advertising their kind of a new moral virtue, which is that, you know, we're beyond the nation state, we're so clever. But what they're really hostile to, I think, is not the idea of the nation state, and I'm very open to the idea that nation states aren't the best way to organise global affairs. I'm open to that suggestion in the long term, historically speaking. But what they're really opposed to, I think, is what is constituted within borders, which is popular sovereignty. That's how popular sovereignty is constituted in the modern world. It's done within borders, whether we like it or not. It tends to work relatively well. That's what they're really concerned about, the popular nature of sovereignty. And the way they get around that, the way they argue against it, is by presenting themselves as these kind of newfangled, super-European cosmopolitans. But I think it's fundamentally driven by an anti-democratic instinct, by a suspicion of ordinary people. And I'm really fascinated by the class dynamic to all of this. The Economist published an interesting piece recently about, it was actually quite a snooty piece, but it ended up being accidentally interesting because it showed up that uneducated people are more likely to be against the EU. Now, The Economist and others think this is because they're stupid. They're not educated, and therefore they're stupid, and therefore against the EU. But I think it's much more likely to speak to a class dynamic, which is that the middle classes, the well-educated, the elites, are generally in favour of the EU because they want to move politics in a new, weird direction, whereas ordinary people are suspicious of people who rule them, particularly if they have no control over them, and so they just feel agitated by the EU. So I think it's really worth looking at the class dynamic, and also the England versus Scotland dynamic, which is also, English people tend to be much more Eurosceptic than Scottish people, which is also interesting, I think.
Yeah, so you spoke about how in a possible post-Brexit scenario that it's not just about us, and that we as European citizens would also have a responsibility to the other people of Europe who want to get out of the EU. Would you have any suggestion about a means of achieving that without damaging our diplomatic reputation and our relationships with the government of those countries?
I don't think we should call on the government to do it. I think we should do it ourselves, through argument, through visiting these people, through creating, I don't know, new structures, new ideas, new ways to connect with people that doesn't involve going through Brussels or going through official channels. Some of that's already happening. You know, left-wing anti-austerity groups are making connections across borders. You know, Podemos and Syriza and various others. Right-wing populist groups are doing likewise, creating these kind of new entities which are cross-border and which are, to a certain extent, driven by a desire to get out of Europe. Out of the EU, sorry, I failed my own test. So it's already happening. My problem is that I don't like either the far right in Europe or these new crappy left-wing movements that are emerging either. So I'm trying to think of other people who are interesting and who I might make connections with. But I think find out in these countries who is interested in leaving the EU, make connections with them, find out more about them, spread their message here, maybe they'll spread our message there. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about, quite informal. But as to what form it will take, I don't know. But all I do know is that to the extent that European peoples have been asked explicitly, do you like the EU? They've said no, for the most part. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So I'm very interested in the idea of forming a unity around that. You know, the phony unity promised by Brussels is not the only kind we have. A unity based on hostility to Brussels, I think, would be a brilliant thing. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about we should do.
You mentioned The Economist earlier. One argument they wrote about recently, which I thought was quite interesting, was that they basically said that the nature of democracy and sovereignty in the 21st century has changed, and that even if we did leave the EU, we'd still be constrained and have a type of sovereignty and democracy that would be pure and powerless. What do you think of that sort of argument, that even if we left the EU, we'd be constrained by the rules of government and other transnational bodies?
The Economist has lost the plot. I can't understand what's happened to The Economist over the past 5 years. They've just gone completely doolally. That's one example. They've just gone down this... The Economist, which I read every week, is now indistinguishable from The Guardian. It's really depressing, actually. But I think they could be right about that, but it's very fatalistic, this idea that there's nothing we can do about all this stuff that's happening because of globalization and international treaties and so on. But the fact is, if you were to bring the discussions about those things home, that would be a change, because it would give us greater control over the discussion about that. Because what you'd have then is a party would have to explicitly have, as part of its manifesto, we will sign up to this treaty or we will sign up to that treaty. And then people would say, well, we're not having that, or argue against it. It would create a more direct discussion about some of those treaties. But I think the vast majority of international treaties could just be torn up. Most of them are just a load of nonsense, and are actually fundamentally about hampering democracy or popular sovereignty. So I'm not really very much in favour of international treaties anyway. I'm very much in favour of international cooperation on the basis of a democratically constituted government talking to other democratically constituted governments and working out what's in our interest, what's in their interests, how can we work it out, that kind of thing is good. But treaties which have this blanket declaration across the globe that you must do A, B, and C, I'm not in favour of that. I'm not in favour of human rights legislation, I'm not in favour of international treaties, I'm not in favour of even war crimes tribunals or any of those things, because democracy and justice don't actually work at the international level. They only work at the national level, because then there is some semblance of democratic control over what they do.
Yes. You mentioned the human rights thing. I don't much like the EU one, but I'd be rather keen to have one. I was curious as to how you thought that might look within non-EU Britain.
Yeah, I'm hugely in favour of freedom. I think we should have more freedom, much more freedom. But I'm not massively in favour of bills of rights. Certainly not as they would be written now, because they would inevitably reflect the generally illiberal outlook of our time, which I think is what happened with the Human Rights Convention. You know, if you think about the American Bill of Rights, comes out of that great, glorious moment in the 18th century, humanist revolutions in Europe and America, people saying, you know, screw you to the old powers, taking controls of their affairs. Very optimistic moment in human history. And lo and behold, the documents that come out of that tend to reflect that optimism. And then the European Convention of Human Rights, or certainly certain European human rights legislation, comes out of the Second World War to a large extent, comes out of the experience of the Holocaust, and unsurprisingly tend to be really depressing as a consequence of that. So these kind of bills and documents and treaties tend to reflect the periods in which they emerge. So I'm pretty convinced that if we were to write one now, it would be a bit depressing and full of caveats and, you know, avoid being offensive and all that crap that you hear on campuses all the time, I'm sure. So I'm not sure. I would like to get rid of the Human Rights Act completely, which was brought into British law in 1998, and rely on what we had up until 1998, which was a long history of laws that grew and emerged and changed and all that kind of stuff, which articulated freedoms in various different ways. I would rather rely on that than human rights law, which is actually an impediment to genuine freedom. Fundamentally, in some point in the future, we could write a whole new liberal democratic constitution, but not now.
ETA?
Sorry?
ETA?
ETA, remind me what?
Estimated time of arrival.
Oh, ETA, right, I thought you were talking about some European treaty. ETA, I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know. So for now, I think the fewer bills and constitutions we have, the better. Let's just rely on instinct and opposing every single attempt by the government to restrict people's freedom.
Do you think people like George Galloway will help or hinder the Brexit campaign? Do you think we should get everyone on board, no matter who they are, or do you think it might put some people off?
Yeah, he could put people off because he's obviously really obnoxious and everyone hates him. So I'm sure he will. But I think a lot of people in the Brexit campaign are a bit weird. So that's just going to happen, I think. You all seem perfectly normal, so that's good. But I think people, the other side, are definitely going to try and present the Brexit camp as a bunch of weirdos. Farage and Galloway and all these losers. And I think we should not let them do that. And that's already happening, actually. When there was that picture of Farage and Galloway, everyone said, look at these idiots, do you really want to be on their side? But the fact is that huge numbers of people in Britain really dislike the EU for very good reasons. And I think we've got to tap into that mass public sentiment and demonstrate that this is a very democratic idea. So I don't think we should let them caricature the Brexit camp. It's the same thing that happened when France and the French and Dutch people, majorities of French and Dutch voters, rejected the EU constitution in 2005. They were denounced as xenophobes and nationalists and far left losers. Every single form of defamation was thrown at them. So however tempting it might be for Brexiters to say, I hate George Galloway, let's kick him out, I think you should probably resist that instinct and just say, look, there is a large groundswell of public support for a Brexit, and that's what we're trying to galvanise and represent.
Yeah.
Can we hear from one?
I was just going to ask about the Schengen zone, because that seems to be one of the most useful, practically useful things about the EU to come out of it. And at least that's partially selfish because I'm a Hungarian citizen, but not a British citizen. But it also seems to me like something which you really need treaties for it to function. What are your thoughts on the Schengen zone? Good thing, bad thing? Could it continue in another form?
Well, the thing is, in relation to the various zones that are set up in Europe, and more importantly, the freedom of movement that is guaranteed by some of them, or the freedom to work, or the freedom to generally live in these various areas, regardless of whether you were born there, that's all good. But I don't think the EU has lived up to its promise of freedom of movement. This is something that has made me extremely unpopular among the Brexit people, which is that I'm really pro-immigration and pro-people living and working wherever they want. And I'm pro-freedom of movement in the EU as well. So I think, but we haven't lived up to that. Britain, for example, imposed in 2006 or 2007 under the new Labour government, when Romania joined the EU, Britain imposed a rule which said that working class people from Romania couldn't come to Britain. So it immediately created this kind of two-tier approach, which was, I think, a really, really bad thing to do, and stupid, and it backfired, and actually undermined all their claims to be kind of, this new Europe where people can move around and work and live and do all these various things. I'm generally in favour of freedom of movement and the freedom to work in various different places. But I am worried about the way in which, at the moment, the EU tends to impose that, whether by treaty or diktat. So, for example, the way in which Merkel basically there was one headline I remember a few months ago which said, Barack Obama and Angela Merkel discuss how many migrants each European nation should take, I remember thinking, I didn't elect Obama or Merkel, so what's that all about? And so I'm worried about, in relation to the immigration discussion, just moving on slightly, I'm worried about the way in which the EU is imposing immigration on the peoples of Europe without any genuine, real democratic discussion about it. So again, it doesn't come back to treaties and diktats and new rules and regulations. It's about having as open and frank and free and democratic a discussion as possible, so that within Hungary they get to discuss whether they take other people or allow people to live and work there. Within Britain, we get to discuss the same thing. Within all these zones and nations, rather, of Europe, people get to have an upfront democratic discussion about who should be free to move and work and live there. That's my ideal scenario. And I'd be on the side of arguing for as much freedom of movement as possible. And some of you may be on the other side. That's how it should work.
Hello, I wanted to ask, on the basis that already, the scare thing, or it's going to take 10 years to unravel, so, this is not going to happen easily. And as time gets closer to the referendum, the press, which seems to be pretty much in favour of staying in, I'm not sure how you're going to get your message out. Don't be afraid. I know when you were speaking on Question Time or whatever it was on Friday night, you were saying, it's great, we need freedom, progressive, let's go for it. And I'm not sure how we're going to get that message out as things get closer and tighter. Because Cameron is a very slippery little eel.
Yeah, yeah, literally, he's horrible. I don't like Cameron. But I think, I don't want to agree with you, but I think I think you're right that it's going to be a real uphill struggle. But I think there's a real danger of being defeatist, and I speak to a lot of Brexit campaigners who already say to me, look, we're going to lose, right? And I'm just like, please don't say that. So I think it's really important to resist the temptation to defeatism and fatalism, which is tempting. So when I was on Any Questions on Friday and I was talking about the EU and the other panellists, apart from Paul Nuttall, Deputy Leader of UKIP, obviously, Lucy Powell was horrible and obnoxious. But their arguments, including Nuttall's actually, were based on fear. And that's their trump card. And that's what Cameron is doing all the time now. If we leave, it will be unpredictable, it will be leap into the dark, no one knows what will happen, things will collapse. But then what's really infuriating me is that people on the Brexit side are then using the same politics of fear. So Boris Johnson had a piece in the Telegraph this week in which he said, don't fall for Project Fear, don't listen to Cameron's fear-mongering. And then he wrapped up his article by saying, the really scary thing is if we stay in Europe because it's unpredictable, who knows what will happen and we'll all die or something like that. So I think both sides are doing that, and that's going to switch people off or piss people off, which will be even worse. So I think yes, Cameron's slippery, yes, the media is generally pro EU, and even worse, they're really, really happy to demonise anyone who's anti-EU, which is where the whole Europhobia things come from. So yes, there is a lot of opposition from the top down against the idea of leaving the EU, but there is a lot of untapped or just completely ignored or demonised public sentiment out there, which is anti-EU, and finding a way to tap into that and galvanise that and make that into some, not necessarily a movement, but certainly into a kind of a big vote. That's the challenge. And I think, I normally hate people who are kind of happy, clappy, let's go out and organise and all that stuff. But I think you can actually do something about that.
We did. We were out on Saturday at a stall, and it's interesting. The people that want to stay, you cannot speak to them. They do not wish to speak to you because you're part of the outside.
Yeah.
And that's the sad part, because I happily went and talked to the inn people who were talking a big load of tosh. Every £10, every £1 you pay and you get £10 back. God knows where they got that figure from. CBI apparently. But this is the problem.
Yeah, they've got a lot of power on their side. They've got the media, they've got a lot of big business, they've got I would say, a large amount of the establishment. So they've got a lot of clout. It's very funny. Often these kind of lefty Guardianista types are the very people who will say, you know, we can't have big business involved in politics. And then as soon as all those businessmen sign a letter saying we must stay in the EU, they're all waving it in the air saying, yeah. So they've got a lot of influential, important people on their side. I would say the majority of the elite supports staying in the EU because it's a very elitist project. So the only way to counter that, I think, is not to say you're organising the referendum in a bad way, or it's too rushed, or Cameron is too horrible, or the media is too biased, all of which may be true, but it's to tap into the people who have the silent majority, or I would say they are, who don't have Guardian columns and don't get on TV all the time, and most people think they're just a bit dim. Those people are the ones we need to tap into, and I think that is really possible, and I'm quite excited about trying to do that. And I think there's a real moment now where we can not only have our own say in this referendum, but we can bring people with us. I think everyone should just give themselves the task of encouraging 10 people to vote. And not just vote, but vote the right way. And then that could have a real impact on the future of, on the whole future of this country in a really unpredictable, exciting way.
Hi, Brendan. Good speech. Enjoyed it. I'm just wondering, okay, so hypothetically, say we do vote to leave. I mean, I was just handed a wonderful article which said when a second power leaves, like a big supranational institution, it tends to lead to the breakup of that institution. So hypothetically, say the EU does break up, how far do you think we should go in terms of this liberty thing? Because obviously you're very libertarian, and obviously if we take that to its natural conclusion, then that's going to be obviously like Catalonia might want to go, Scotland might want to go, and should we begin to give should we make more smaller political units? Because obviously, like we see with, take the Leave campaign right now, it's very factionalised. You have like grassroots out tussling with Leave, vote Leave, tussling with Leave.eu, and it's hard to get one narrative going, which, kind of I feel hinders us slightly. So I guess, obviously, when we're talking about this whole freedom thing, how far down do you think it needs to go? Because obviously if we're going on this journey, obviously questions to it, do we want an English Parliament? Do we want to give Scotland more power? What are we going to do with, Ireland, Wales, or if we give you an England's own Parliament, what about the North, what about the South? Everyone wants something different, so I'm just wondering how far do you think we should go?
Yeah, I don't think we should do any of that. I don't think, except Northern Ireland should be part of Ireland. That's the only thing I think in relation to that. I'm in favour of Irish unity. I don't think, I'm not in favour of the breakup of the United Kingdom into all these little countries or these little local parliaments, like John Prescott once suggested a north-east parliament or something. I mean, what the hell? So I'm not in favour of any of that, and I don't think that's got anything to do with freedom, actually, or with democracy. And I was against Scotland leaving the United Kingdom because I don't think that was driven by a democratic instinct. I think that was driven actually by an attempt to avoid democracy. If you read a lot of the stuff that was being said by people who were in favour of Scotland leaving the Union, it was things like, we can't get our own way because, there are too many Tories down south and we can't really have what we want and do what we want. And it was really about saying, well, we can't convince a majority of people in Britain to do the kind of things we want to do or to follow us or to join us. So we'll just cut ourselves off and live in this bubble and then we can do whatever the hell we want. It was a real abdication of democratic responsibility, democratic drive, the instinct to inspire people and influence people. That's what drove that, I think. I think the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, I think these are anti-democratic people. And then obviously the most idiotic thing they did is say, oh, we really want to get out of the UK in order to be more independent. And then the first thing we'll do is join the EU, which destroys every nation's independence at a fundamental level. So it wasn't about national independence. It was about how can we jump off this train, which is not going in the direction that we like and which we feel we don't have the moral or political resources to change the direction of. So it was a real cowardly cop-out. In contrast, the campaign to get Britain out of the EU is very democratic because it is about ensuring that the people within this nation have more democratic clout, have more democratic say, can have the debates among themselves, change minds, argue, disagree, fight, all those things. So I don't think it's comparable, and I really hate the modern movement, which I think is driven by identity politics more than nationalism, for the removal of Scotland and Catalonia and all these various other silly places which shouldn't be independent nations. Not silly places. They would be silly places if they were countries.
Well, thank you very much for a really well articulated speech from you. We need more of this. I think we need to get more people on board from you, so thanks for that. Now, two very quick questions. First one is, in the old days when the Union flag, or Jack, when it's on a ship, was flown upside down and the ship was in distress for some reason. Now, what distresses me is that the European Union is the wrong way up. We elect the Parliament, and more importantly, we can vote them out, but the people at the top, the Commission, we can't. If that was turned the right way up, would you consider staying in? And secondly, is the Union flag put in distress on purpose and not projected?
I think, no. See, I hear this argument from people who want to stay all the time. They say, but surely we have some control because we elect MEPs. Obviously, no one really elects MEPs, do they? It's like 20% of voters or something. Who can name their MEP? I mean, you all probably can because you're interested in this. But if you talk to 100 people on the street and ask them who their MEP is, I think maybe 3 would be able to say it. So anyway, but no, even if it was made the right way round, so the European Parliament was on top, I'd still be opposed to it because the idea of having a parliament in Britain, which we all vote for and it makes our laws and we can engage with it, and then having another parliament creates this ridiculous conflict of democracy, which is really actually deeply problematic. This is why I'm also opposed to having an elected House of Lords. I want no House of Lords. I want no second chamber at all, which is not the most popular point of view. But I'm against it being elected because it creates this conflict. Who's really sovereign? Who's really in charge? Who really represents the people? And it gives rise to elite squabbling. You know, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. Well, we're going to do it. No, I'm going to do it. And
so you think the distance between places in the UK and London is the maximum amount of disengagement, both in terms of distance and in terms of number of population who can vote in certain?
No, I think people should vote for one parliament, and then they have a very direct relationship with that parliament. You know, a parliament may have one chamber or 2 chambers, but they should vote in one parliament. What you create when you have a situation where you're voting for 2 parliaments, it does instantly raise the question: who's the authority here? Who's really in charge? And I wouldn't be surprised if there are MEPs walking around Brussels and Strasbourg saying, "Oh, we're the bosses," because you know we're in Europe, so we have this overview of the whole nation, so we know what's best. They have this phony sense of authority, I'm sure. Well, they do. I've spoken to them, and that's what they're like. They're really arrogant, annoying people. So I think I'm against the EU, even if it was democratised, which I don't think is really possible, but even if it was democratised and the Parliament was put on top and the EC pushed a bit down, I'd still be against it, because in that situation it would create a really deeply problematic conflict of democratic authority, which would take away from our right to shape our Parliament.
Time for 2 more questions. So, yes.
I just want to take issue with, you've said it 3 times now, the fact that the media are very much all pro-Brexit. The Free West, other way around, the Free West influential papers are probably the Daily Mail, the Sun, and arguably the Daily Express. And all 3 of them are pro-Brexit.
Only one of them is the Express.
So the Mail is certainly
They'll all change when it comes to crunch.
But perhaps, but so why do you say that the media is unanimously on the side of in when there is very, very strong media presence, certainly in the printed press, for out?
Yeah, I don't think I said the media is unanimously
No, you didn't
on
say
the side of
unanimously,
it.
but you made it very clear that you thought that you were up against it in terms.
I think we are up against it. Absolutely. I think the media, the mass media, like tabloids that are read by ordinary people, doesn't have as much clout in political establishment circles as the elite media, like the broadsheet media, the Times, the Guardian in particular, those two in particular. Those are the newspapers of record. Those are the newspapers which are read by the elites, which facilitate discussions among the elites. So I was talking about the political establishment. Now, what I mean by the political establishment is most politicians, the civil service, the elite sections of the media, elite opinion formers, that kind of very elite cast of people who do set the agenda in Britain in a pretty concerted way. And the Daily Mail is in the corner shouting, oh, fuck you all, and all that stuff. And the Sun is, winding everyone up with naked women. We know, so they're there, and they are read by millions of people, and they have an impact. But they tend to be brushed off by this establishment, this kind of new PC pseudo-liberal establishment, which is the one, I think, at the moment, which is setting the run-in in relation to the EU. But we have it, as I've said, within our power to change that. One of the ways you can do that is through the media. So there is an opening for that. And there's an opening through political campaigning and so on.
Thanks for coming. It's great to hear you talk finally. I would love to come back on your points on unicameralism and federalism, but what I would actually like to ask is, do you feel that there could be a tension between your belief in personal freedom, which is either classical liberal or libertarian, however you want to call it, and Brexit? Do you think that what you've said is that the European Union is inimical to freedom? In practice, when we leave, if we leave, but when we leave, as I believe, do you think there is a danger that we may end up with a settlement that leaves Britain unfree nevertheless, that it might unleash forces that make us less free in some other way?
Maybe. I mean, who knows what will happen? Everything could go tits up. It could be really bad in the short term, or maybe even in the medium term. But this whole thing of it's a leap into the dark, it's risky, it's uncertain, I embrace that. And I think one of the arguments that the Brexit campaign should put forward is, what's wrong with taking a risk? What's wrong with leaping into the unknown? That is how pretty much every single bit of progress in history has come about. Think about the people who set sail, this is the point I made on Any Questions, think about the people who set sail for America. They didn't know where the hell they were going, they didn't know if they were going to die, if they were going to fall off the end of the earth. But they still did it. So if Cameron had been around, he'd be saying, no, you can't do that, it's a leap into the dark, and they'd all stay at home and we wouldn't have discovered America. That's the way I think about it. So, so on the one hand, yes, it would be a leap into the dark because we've been embroiled in the EU for so long. But on the other hand, I think Douglas Murray or someone made this point, it would also be it would actually be a return to the familiar. It would be a return to how things were done for decades and decades before the EU, centuries. So it would not be. So it would fall in between those two things, I think, because you can't just switch and go back to the old way of doing things overnight. So I think yes, there would be uncertainty. There might be some discomfort. There might even be a few economic knocks. But I think those are prices worth paying for regrouping our democratic rights. I think any price is worth paying. I don't think you can, when the Stay campaign say, oh, you'll be £3,000 a year worse off. Number one, that's just made up. Number two, they think our democratic rights are worth 3,000 quid. I mean, that's extraordinary. So when they say that, my instinct is not to argue back and say, actually, it will be £867 or anything like that. But just to say, well, that's fine. If that's true, that is a price worth paying for the right of people in Britain to have direct, interactive control over the institutions that rule them. Bring it on. So we should welcome the uncertainty and the risk and the leap into the dark, rather than kind of running scared from it.
Alright, thank you everyone for coming. So next Wednesday we will be debating the pro-EU law, the Cambridge for Europe law. Details of that will be coming out in the next couple of days. So please do like our Facebook page, Cambridge Brexit campaign, and also we'll sign up to the mailing list if you've written it down there. Thank you again for everyone coming. Please join me in thanking Brendan.
Thanks, Harry.